Hi, I'm David Booth. Today's webinar by Dr. Mark Musen is one in a series of webinars about various aspects of the Yosemite Project. The Yosemite Project is a collaborative effort whose mission is to achieve semantic interoperability of all structured healthcare information. And Dr. Musen, if you could switch to the first roadmap slide. The Yosemite Project articulates an ambitious roadmap for achieving interoperability based on RDF as a universal information representation. And if you'd go to the next slide, please. So today's webinar by Dr. Musen is on the use of OWL in ICD-11 fits into the left-hand portion of the Yosemite roadmap, which is about standardizing the standards. And it describes one of the ways that healthcare terminologies are moving closer toward standardizing the standards. Dr. Musen is director of the Stanford University Center for Biomedical Informatics Research. He conducts research related to intelligent systems, reusable ontologies, metadata for publication of scientific data sets, and biomedical decision support. His group is the one that developed Protege, which is the most widely used ontology editor. He's the principal investigator of the National Center for Biomedical Ontology, one of the original national centers for biomedical computing created by the US, at the National Institute of Health in the US. He is also principal investigator of the Center for Expanded Data Annotation and Retrieval, otherwise known as CEDAR. CEDAR is a center of excellence supported by the NIH Big Data to Knowledge initiative, with the goal of developing new technology to ease the authoring and management of biomedical experimental metadata. And before we get started, before Dr. Musen gets started, I just want to remind everybody that if you have a question during the presentation, please feel free to email it directly to me. That's david@dbooth.org. That's david@dbooth.org. And I will be checking my email for questions, and we will have some time at the end for some Q&A. Dr. Musen, welcome. We're very glad to have you.
Thanks, David, and thanks everybody for joining this morning. What I'm going to do in the next hour or so is give you an update and for some of you an introduction to where the ICD revision process is. ICD is the International Classification of Diseases. It is by far the largest standard that's used for describing diseases and causes of illness that is adopted internationally. And what I want to do is show you how we're about to transition over the next, well, WHO would like to think 3 or 4 years. Is probably going to be a lot longer in the United States, from ICD-10, which was just incorporated in the US last fall, to ICD-11. I call this talk Struck by OWL, not because we really care in this talk about the furry little creatures, but WHO clearly has been struck by OWL as a semantic web standard. And that whole notion is consistent with a lot of the discussion that took place last fall when ICD-10 became the method in the United States for representing diseases and disorders for purposes of medical billing. So last fall, we moved to ICD-10. And with it came a whole bunch of artists who made a lot of money talking about ICD-10 codes, such as struck by duck, not to be confused with struck by owl, and other ICD-10 codes which people found quite amusing, such as forced landing of spacecraft injuring occupant, initial encounter, inadequate social skills not elsewhere classified, and lots of others. Summarized, so ICD as a general principle has been around for a very long time. It has its origins in the 1900s when people first wanted to figure out how to standardize the way in which death certificates were encoded. And now it represents the definitive enumeration of causes of morbidity and mortality that are used internationally. I want to apologize for my aggressive spell checker in the abstract for this talk. I didn't mean mortality and morality, but rather mortality and morbidity. And so there's sort of a curious accident there. Every 10 to 20 years is what WHO calls a major revision of ICD, although there are releases constantly as the terms in ICD get tweaked. And the ICD is so important because if you can't be a member of the United Nations unless you agree to report all your public health information to WHO using ICD. And in the US, as you well know, ICD is required by law as the basis for reimbursement under Medicare and Medicaid. And as a consequence, all the other insurers in the US require ICD as well. So ICD gets a lot of press. We know that ICD changes a lot. We know that over time, diseases disappear. So diseases like dropsy and consumption, which may have been popular in the 1900s, are diseases that nobody would ever talk about. And we know that diseases need to be added. And just over the past couple of decades, we've noted the addition of Legionnaire's disease and toxic shock syndrome and AIDS and SARS. And now Zika virus is making its way into ICD, because basically ICD has to capture every possible cause of morbidity and mortality that might be relevant for public health reporting. So ICD-10 was developed 30 years ago over a period of time, and it represented sort of the old style means by which people developed health standards. 17 to 58 UN member nations participated. Each one sent 1 to 5 people. They all met in Geneva in a very august location. Although the principal method by which the terminology was created is what WHO now, in retrospect, calls the decibel method of authoring. Basically, whoever yelled the loudest got his changes incorporated. They noted over time that there was no way of translating ICD easily into something which might interoperate with EHRs. It was only in English. No one bothered to test it. And by the time everyone was finished, nobody was really happy with the results. So I shouldn't say that too publicly, but there's been a lot of concern. And there were a lot of papers and articles that appeared in the literature as the US decided a couple of years ago finally to bite the bullet and move from ICD-9 to ICD-10. Indeed, many of you may remember the Wall Street Journal's article of a couple of years ago pointing out all the various ICD-10 codes describing how one might be bitten by a turtle, and how many people wondered, well, yeah, you can be bitten by a turtle, but can you really be struck by a turtle? And is that really a legitimate code to include in ICD? I won't get into that major legal debate, but part of the problem that was pointed out in the Wall Street Journal article, and that many people have wrung their hands over, is the incredible granularity of ICD-10. And also the fact that ICD-10 is pre-coordinated with every possible combination of every possible term, leading to what folks at the University of Manchester over time have called the exploding bicycle problem. In particular, what they pointed out is you go back to ICD-9 from the 1970s, there were a handful of codes in ICD-9 that dealt with what called the exploding bicycle problem. In particular, what they pointed out is you go back to ICD-9 from the 1970s, there were a handful of codes in ICD-9 that dealt with
I'm getting feedback now, and I
Dr. Musen, your sound has suddenly gotten very strange. You're getting a lot of echo.
I'm getting feedback now.
Yeah. Do you have a second mic that got turned on somehow?
I only have one microphone.
Gotten very strange. You're getting a lot of echo. Yeah. Do you have a second mic that got turned on somehow?
I only have one microphone.
Very strange.
I wonder if is there someone who needs to mute his line?
Try muting yourself for just a moment.
I wonder.
Okay, see if that makes it happy, Eric. Oh no.
I think we're okay.
Oh yes, good. See if that makes it happy, Eric.
I think we're okay.
Oh yes, good. See if that makes it happy, Eric.
I think we're okay.
Oh yes, good. See if that makes it happy, Eric.
What I will do is continue the talk, and I'll turn my headphones off completely in case there's some sort of a feedback that way. This is really quite bizarre.
Yeah. Okay.
And so the idea was fundamentally that in ICD-9 there were only a handful of codes that would describe the possible ways in which one could get injured on a bicycle. And the Manchester folks were quite amused to point out that by the time ICD-10 came along, there were about 587 codes for such accidents, which were really quite amusing. Codes like occupant of three-wheeled motor vehicle injured in collision with pedal cycle person on outside of vehicle non-traffic accident while working for income. And you can read the others on this slide, and it basically has been an embarrassment in some sense to the ICD-10 that the assortment of codes that have emerged because of the way things are put together in ICD-10 leads to these kinds of ridiculous relationships. And so when ICD-11 was conceived maybe 10 years ago, it had a number of goals. And these are the goals that were defined by WHO at the time. The idea of having a multi-purpose and coherent classification for mortality, morbidity, primary care, clinical care, research, public health. The idea that it would be a multilingual resource, that it would interoperate with EHRs, that therefore it was going to be developed from the beginning as a digital product, that it would support electronic health records and information systems, and that it would link to all the other extant terminologies that were viewed as important, including SNOMED and GO. So if you look at ICD-10, which is what we have now, basically ICD-10 is a list of terms. And what ICD-11 does is to adopt a very rich model of disorders, all of which is based in OWL, and uses this model in order to come up with a rich way of describing the disorders and diseases that are in ICD. So if you look at this slide, which comes directly from WHO, what you see are all the new features that they're touting, the idea that ICD-11 will be internet-based, that it will have this explicit content model of the terms, that it will be tested in field trials, that it will have input from all the possible stakeholders, that everything will be will include a definition and additional information about the terms, and that'll be ready for use with electronic health records, and that it obviously will be multilingual and support all the official UN languages. And where we are right now is that we are in the beta release of ICD-11. So right now there's a version that is being field tested, uses OWL as its fundamental language. It's edited in a collaborative web-based environment called Ikat, which I'll show you in a moment. Links to SNOMED as well as the International Classification of Functional Status. And what's interesting about ICD-11, which is a wild departure, is that it attempts to be a comprehensive terminology that has a series of views, what WHO calls linearizations, so that WHO can extract different classifications that are coherent with each use case. So use cases for mortality, for morbidity, for primary care, and a variety of others. They've also crowdsourced this. So there's a way in which people in the community can make suggestions for changes to ICD. And as I said, is undergoing careful peer review, not only in the crowdsource mode, but also by a set of domain experts who are looking at the terms very carefully. So ICD basically now has about 65,000 classes, 49,000 references to external terminologies. 25 of those classes have real definitions. About 293 users have worked together across the world to put together this terminology using the Ikat tool. And there are about 62,000 comments that people have made on the evolving terminology, which have resulted in refining the terminology over time with, as you see, nearly 750,000 edits to the terminology. As WHO describes it, the content model is a structured framework that defines a classification unit in ICD in a standard way in terms of its components that allows for computerization. What that means is that the content model describes a variety of units, which can be categories of diseases, whole blocks of related diseases that kind of fit together, and then chapters of related diseases, largely on the basis of the mode of disease, whether it's infection or cancer or whatever else, as a way of organizing the whole structure. And the content model itself includes lots of information as described in this slide, also from WHO, with the concept title, the classification properties, some textual definition, and what's also interesting, body structure description. So where in the anatomy does this disease occur? Manifestation properties. What are the signs and symptoms of the disease? What causes the disease? What are its temporal properties? How do you define severity of this disease? And so on. And so it represents an opportunity to create something which is on the border between a strict ontology and a knowledge base, which, when filled out to the degree indicated by the content model, provides a lot of information about those diseases. And so you can see in this example of the content model filled in for myocardial infarction, the idea that you have certain parameters like the body system that the disease occurs in, like the cardiovascular system, the body part that's involved, such as the heart, signs and symptoms, crushing chest pain, findings that you would find on investigations, such as particular patterns in the ECG, and so on. And in ICD, what we see is that ICD-11 allows us to have a rich model that starts out with a content model, which basically is this high-level model of what are the kinds of terms that we need to represent, what are the properties of terms, what are the value sets that are used to create those descriptions. That provides the structure for the actual ICD entities, which are the filled-in values of the content model, which provide the terms, was something that the WHO calls the foundation component. And those terms are then used to create what WHO calls linearizations. Basically, what are the list of codes we would care about for defining mortality? What are the list of codes for morbidity? What about primary care? What are the codes we care about in care situations that are resource limited, and so on. And so there's the ontology component, which represents the content model, the foundation component, which is the actual terms, and the linearizations, which are the views. And so using slides from WHO, they view ICD-11 as being this enormous filing cabinet of all the possible terms that one might want to use, with the idea that for different purposes, one might start from this filing cabinet and select a set of terms for oncology or a set of terms for dermatology. And the idea being that the terms in the foundation component are represented in standard kind of an OWL framework with multiple inheritance, and that needs to be translated to linearizations, which basically expunge all the multiple inheritance, because in ICD, the actual classification that is used in the field cannot have multiple parents, because this is used by statisticians to do analyses of epidemiologic data, and therefore every disease has to fit into exactly one category to avoid double counting of disorders. And so as a consequence, the linearizations expunge all of the multiple inheritance, all the complexities of the ontology, and give you just the traditional ICD-9 or ICD-10 style laundry list of terms. And lots of tools are being used to develop ICD-11, and I'm just going to give you an introduction to a couple of them. First, I want to talk about the Ikat Platform. This is basically the tool that we developed here at Stanford based on Protege, which many of you are familiar with. And so Ikat has functions involving managing the hierarchy of terms, entering and editing the content that describe particular terms. So here we see, for example, the term ischemic heart disease in the hierarchy being filled out with its definition in the middle panel, and information which represents what are the topics and issues that get raised as the 300-odd users of Ikat discuss these terms and raise questions about how the hierarchy is being developed and how the terms are being defined. And so ICD is edited in this Ikat tool. This is the screen dump of the tool overall. It's very busy, but this is the way WHO likes it. And what you see on the left-hand side are the terms that are in the basic hierarchy of ICD categories. You see different indicators. You see a red circle for a term which is still under discussion and requires lots of refinement before it's going to be made public. The yellow indicator suggests a term which is nearing completion and people are reasonably happy with it, though it hasn't received complete endorsement, whereas the blue dots in the hierarchy represent those terms that have been quote unquote finished that now can be sent out for crowdsourcing where others can comment on the way those terms are modeled. And we see on the right hand side of the screen a whole set of panels that are used to define information about the terms. And I'll show you a few of those panels, but obviously won't have time to go through all of them. So ICAT, as I said, is based on Web Protege. Web Protege is our free open source collaborative ontology development environment. We view it as Google Docs for ontologies because basically we maintain a server at Stanford, or you can create your own. That makes it easy to just use a web browser to get access to an interface for creating and editing ontologies in the complete OWL Tools standard. And we're finding that although our desktop version of Protege is still very popular because it represents OWL 2 in its most complete form, people really like doing this online on the web just because it's so much easier. And so ICAT represents Web Protege specialized for the ICD. And we can see within ICAT, we can do things such as specify the term properties. We can say that angina pectoris is the term. It has synonyms like angina attack or angina of effort. It has angina pectoris syndrome as a synonym. We can indicate terms that are included in the definition, base terms which should be excluded from the definition. We can look at the classification properties and we can see basically what are the how we classify the disease. Is it a disease? Is it a disorder? Is it something that's due to external causes of injury, and so on? And we can identify what linearizations angina pectoris or any particular term might belong to. So then we can say, for example, that any good linearization of morbidity or mortality or primary care, either in high resource or low resource settings, would include angina pectoris, for example. And then we have clinical descriptions. What body system does it belong to? What body part is affected by this disease? What are editorial properties? So is it blue, ready to be shown to the world? Is it yellow with some caveats? Is it red, where we're still working on it within WHO? And basically, who is responsible for finally signing off on this term? What topic advisory group is responsible for making sure that the definitions in that particular term are appropriate? And one of the things that ICD-11 finally tries to fix is this question of pre-coordination versus post-coordination. So recall in pre-coordination, basically you have every possible code is listed with all possible ways in which that code could be paired with modifiers, which is combinatorially explosive. It makes the statisticians very happy because there is exactly one parent for every code. Post-coordination is much more scalable. You have to basically at runtime figure out how to put things together, but it is something that causes pause among the statisticians because of the possibility of multiple codes falling into different lineages, and also basically because you can actually put pieces together that give you some highly silly relationships. So obviously our goal is to avoid having terms like, oh, victim of volcanic eruption, street and highway while resting, sleeping, eating, or engaging in other vital activities. We want to be able to, in ICD-11, recognize that if we, for example, we want to code external causes of bicycle injuries, that there are 10 things that can get hit. There are 5 roles for someone being injured. There are 5 activities that they might be doing when they might be injured. There are a couple contexts. And not only can we, in a post-coordinated way, piece these together, but we can have basically sanctioning rules that will tell us what are the ways of piecing them together so they actually make the most sense. And so in ICAT, we have for each term, for each possible linearization in which it might appear, the ability to basically check off how that term might appear in, say, the morbidity linearization, as you see here, where we're saying in the case of this term, it's going to have a severity description, which will be post-coordinated, is going to have a temporal pattern of onset or an onset description, which will be post-coordinated. And so all of those terms will come out of something called the X chapter in ICD-11, which basically provides the value sets for how post-coordination is performed. What are the kinds of severity descriptions? What's the temporal coding that can be incorporated? What are possible etiologies and so on? And so if we look at the way in which this actually is carried out, let's look at asthma. In the case of asthma, we can say, for example, that the morbidity linearization might involve a severity description and a temporal pattern or an onset description. And we can get the way in which those post-coordinated terms are added to asthma by looking at custom scales, which you see here on the right. So you see a custom scale that one creates for severity in the case of lung function for asthma, and define in the case of asthma what mild, moderate, severe are, because obviously mild, moderate, severe asthma might be described very differently from, say, mild, moderate, severe chest pain or angina. What is the temporal pattern for angina in the context of this linearization, and so on. And so we can see, for example, in the case of asthma, mild asthma means that lung function is 80% normal. Moderate lung function means it's 60 to 80% normal. Severe is 60% of normal or worse, and so on. And so basically, ICD-11 gives the user the ability to be very clear about how to define qualifiers, which then will get post-coordinated with the terms that matter. The other thing that ICD-11 does is to recognize that we want to have in ICD-11 the actual pre-coordinated version of the term as something which can be stored in a hierarchy as well. And so what we have to do is to say, if we're going to say that we're going to create for a linearization the idea that one has asthma, that it can be mild, that it can be persistent, we say, well, that's actually a term called mild persistent asthma. And so the post-coordinated combination of asthma, mild, and persistent also then becomes a pre-coordinated term, which makes it possible to store information about that. Now, the user never sees the OWL definition. What the user knows is that by indicating that mild persistent asthma is a preferred term, it can be both post-coordinated at the time that codes are created with ICD-11 and also exist in the pre-coordinated OWL representation. The other thing that ICAT does, as I mentioned earlier, is not only allow one to edit ICD-11, but also to deal with the whole problem of hundreds of users distributed around the world, all working together on this terminology. And to do that, they need to be able to write notes to one another, to have discussions about those notes, to be able to know when something that they care about gets changed by some other developer, and to actually identify what changes may have taken place. And so, for example, as is the case with Web Protege, we can have threaded notes where users describe their concerns about the way something gets modeled in ICD-11. Other developers can respond to that with their concerns, and so on. Users can say, okay, you know, I don't have anything to say right now about the particular elements of the hierarchy that matter to me. But for example, if I care about mental and behavioral disorders, then I can say, I want to watch that. If anybody makes any changes to that ICD code, please tell me about it. Or I can even watch a whole branch of the tree. I want to know if diseases of the nervous system get changed, or I want to know if any subclass of diseases of the nervous system gets changed as well. And as a consequence, I will get email that tell me that's been changed. I want to be able to browse the change history and know what actually has been done to modify terms, so I can decide whether I want to weigh in on those changes and determine whether I have something that I want to report back to the group, and maybe perhaps reconsider changes that have been made. What's also cool is that because all the changes are stored internally to ICAT, as is the case with Web Protege, we can get summary statistics. So we can see, for example, what are the changes that are being made over the course of time. So we can see that, for example, there are lots of changes that are being made just before releases or revisions are being evaluated. We can also see, for example, who's making changes. We can see on this log scale there are some authors of ICD-11 who are incredibly busy, who do a lot of the work. We can also see there are a whole bunch of deadbeats who seem to do very little. And for people who are trying to manage the terminology development process, they can see basically who are the authors they may want to give particular attention to. And also, because different people work on different parts of ICD-11, we can see who is collaborating with whom. And so it's possible, again, to manage the process by taking a look at the contributors, seeing who is basically often in the middle of all the activity, who are the people who tend to collaborate with one another, and get a sense for what is the social structure that's leading to the collaboration of ICD. And what I've shown you so far is how ICAT has been used to create ICD-11. I want to say that is really where we wish everything were going. Unfortunately, a lot of the folks involved in the ICD-11 development work really are bound to spreadsheets. And what has disappointed us, but I guess should not be all that surprising, is that the clinicians who are working on the ICD-11 releases basically feel much more familiar with spreadsheets than almost any other medium of self-expression. And so we spent a lot of time making it possible to have very, very detailed spreadsheets that people use, and to have mechanisms whereby people can download and upload information from spreadsheets, which basically get almost as much attention as the ICAT tool itself. And to make our lives more complicated, what's interesting about ICD-11 is that it also includes a chapter which tries to come up with a consensus of traditional medicine, traditional Chinese medicine, traditional Korean medicine, and Kempo, the traditional Japanese medicine. There's not a single version of either of these patterns of healthcare in ICD-11, but there is a consensus that's called the International Classification of Traditional Medicine. And as you can imagine, creating the facilities to describe disorders of qi and yin and yang was actually kind of interesting for us as well. So I mentioned that there are other tools involved in the ICD revision. We talked about ICAT, which is the extension to Web Protege for doing that. There's also the public platform that WHO created, which is essentially a website that basically anybody in the world can go to, can register with, and the ICD-11 platform makes it possible for anyone to make a comment on any term in ICD-11. And what WH is doing, which I think is really quite novel, is to use this public platform as a way of getting early feedback on ICD-11 and using that to make changes to ICD-11 ahead of having those terms actually endorsed by experts. So the public platform basically is used to create feedback, to get proposals for changes. And every night, the public platform that gathers the crowdsourced information is synced up with the ICAT information that we're getting through Protege, so that basically all of the comments entered by the public become comments that are visible in Web Protege. People can use this public platform to translate back and forth between different languages, so they can basically look at ICD in their own language and leave comments in whatever language is appropriate for them. And basically to manage the proposals for change that people might make. Ultimately, the public platform is going to be used for public voting and scoring of change proposals. And as I said, the public platform and ICAT sync up so that any change in one place leads to a change someplace else. And what's most important in this case are the comments that are made by authors in ICAT and the comments made by the crowdsourced individuals who enter the public platform and make comments there. And frankly, what's really astonishing to me is the degree of activity that the public platform has received. We see people all over the world making proposals for changes to ICD-11. I don't know how many of those change proposals are actually being implemented by WHO, but WHO is paying a lot of attention to what the public has to say about ICD. And not surprisingly, they do so because there's a lot of politics assigned to what codes get in and what codes get out, because people obviously have a strong vested interest in making sure that ICD-11 is as complete as possible, but also includes the kinds of terms for diseases that matter in their particular local areas. So where do we stand right now? Well, ICD-11 basically is in a situation where WHO staff are working to finish it off, trying to complete a lot of missing content. As I mentioned, not only do we have the peer review by the crowdsource workers, but we also have peer review by a number of experts who are looking at the terminology very carefully. One of the main things that is important to the WHO is what they call stability assurance. They want to make sure that ICD-11 can be translated backwards into ICD-10, because the way in which ICD-11 will be unveiled to the world will be through a linearization, which basically replicates ICD-10, eventually then allowing people to adopt linearizations which are more sophisticated and hopefully more interesting. And as I said, there's ongoing field testing in multiple locations right now to ensure that ICD-11 is able to meet all of its requirements. So that field testing is looking at the scientific accuracy of each individual term and the way that term is represented. The field testing is looking at the completeness of each block. They're looking at inconsistency across the terminology, because there's already problems when you have one chapter of ICD that deals with internal medicine and another chapter that deals with pediatrics. And obviously many pediatric diseases become diseases of adults. Many diseases of internal medicine are also diseases of cancer. And so there's a lot of work to make sure that things are consistent across the various chapters of ICD-11. Making sure that every unit, every term, every component is relevant and has appropriate utility. And as I said, everything has to be backward compatible with ICD-10. So what are the questions that are raised by all of this work? Well, if anything, I think ICD-11 has provided another good example of how an OWL ontology can scale up in the large. Shows how editing can be supported across the world in multiple workflows, both within the context of a tool like Web Protege and the context of tools like spreadsheets, and how one can basically provide collaborative functions that support the interactions of people who are distributed in both time and space. And I think what's also quite interesting is not only do we have social networking functionality with an Ikat, which has been very, very important for the development of ICD-11, but also we've seen work in eScience, which takes advantage of this, and in particular in the case of ICD-11, social networking involving citizen scientists or people with a vested interest who are turning to the web platform to make their own comments on ICD-11 and hopefully make it a better terminology. So what can you take away from all this work? Well, what's I think interesting is that we know that semantic web technologies can scale and manage large clinical terminologies. We've seen this in the case of terminologies like the NCI thesaurus and with the foundational model of anatomy. I think ICD-11 shows it for the first time in a terminology which is also quite large. It's being used internationally in a very, very broad sense. We know that we can build tools that are based on Web Protege that can shield subject matter experts from the complexity of OWLs, and can open up that terminology to crowdsourcing. So both techniques, which I think are really very interesting for the future of controlled terminologies in biology and medicine. And sadly, I guess no matter how hard we work on the tools, we know that experts still like spreadsheets best, and we have to certainly accommodate those as well. And frankly, what the ICD-11 experience has shown is that, as is the case with all ontology engineering projects, the hard stuff is never really technical. It's all social. It's getting people to work together. It's people to feel comfortable interacting in authoring projects that involve people with many different languages and cultures. And the fact that what ultimately is going to be in a terminology is often bound by culture, because we have to be aware of the way in which culture determines what is appropriate for medical practice in a variety of different settings. And so I think it's sort of exciting to see all this happening. As I said, the World Health Assembly allegedly will meet in 2018 and endorse all of this, in which case ICD-11 will become the official replacement for ICD-10. I don't see that happening for a while in the US. As you know, we're still getting used to ICD-10 in the United States. But it's interesting to know that ICD-11 is just around the corner, and eventually we'll be dealing with semantic web technology in a place where I think, frankly, I never expected to see it before. Is just around the corner, and eventually we'll be dealing with semantic web technology.
Okay. Are you unmuted now?
Just around the corner, and eventually we'll be dealing with. Okay.
We may have a challenge here doing the Q&A. But thank you, Dr. Musen. We have time for a few questions, and I have a few questions queued up here.
Okay.
So if we can make the sound work
here doing the Q&A.
Then I will try to ask the question. So maybe you can try to somehow mute while I'm asking the question, and then unmute while you're answering it, or something like that. So the first question here is, actually, it's about ICD-10. Let's see. There have been complaints about the lack of compatibility between ICD-10 and ICD-9. You mentioned that ICD-10 is essentially a subset of ICD-11. Did the use of OWL play any role in this? And if so, what?
I would say the ICD-9, of course, is something which people have had major concerns about, but it was created in the 1970s, and frankly, by the time WHO came out with ICD-10, they were disavowing ICD-9. We were, of course, the last country on the planet to adopt ICD-10. I don't think OWL had a major role in making it possible for ICD-11 to be back compatible with ICD-10. I think one could have implemented the view mechanism in a variety of ways, but certainly being able to view each of the terms in ICD-11 in terms of an OWL set of definitions simplifies the linearization process, because it provides a way of basically having a representation that encapsulates each one of those terms and makes it easier to mix and match them. But I would say overall one could have accomplished the same goal in a variety of ways.
Okay. Next question. How much knowledge did the medical subject matter experts need to have of OWL when using ICAT?
And the answer is none. As you saw from the user interface, our goal was to make it so that no one would actually see OWL directly. So all of the forms that are in ICAT basically are web forms that people fill out without any real reference to the underlying terminology, or representation rather. So people are shielded from all of the OWL axioms that are generated. They're shielded from basically anything that would be off-putting. That said, they still prefer spreadsheets to ICAT.
Okay. Next question. How was ICAT developed as a special front end for Web Protege? How feasible would it be to create other specialized editors for other vocabularies? Is there a toolkit for it?
There's not a toolkit. There are some very talented developers. But the good news is that ICAT is fairly easy to customize. ICAT is based on Google Web Toolkit. It basically has the same kind of plugin architecture that Desktop Protege has. And so we've customized Web Protege for the ICD-11 purpose. Before the International Classification of Traditional Medicine was wrapped into ICD-11, we had a separate version of Web Protege that was just for traditional medicine. We've created for WHO a version of Web Protege that works just for the representation of terms related to patient safety. And so I think the flexibility of Web Protege makes it easy to create these special versions of the tool that are really tailored for various terminologies.
I should reiterate that if anybody has a question they would like to ask, you can email it directly to me. That's david@dbooth.org. And our next question, could ICAT be used with other models, such as with the CIMI models, the Clinical Information Modeling Initiative?
I've always been intrigued by that idea. I mean, CIMI is represented in archetype definition language, which is I guess, a variant of UML. We don't have good UML support within Protege, but that is something that we would like to be able to do, or at least have mechanisms for translation. I think in general, one of the things that's been a great interest to me is to be able to take the models coming out of CIMI and make them available in the bioportal tool that we manage through the National Center for Biomedical Ontology. Making them editable through Protege is not something I had considered, but certainly would be an interesting idea.
Okay. Next question. Could Ikat be adapted to work with HL7 FHIR resource definitions?
That would be a great thing to do. And I think, obviously, our ability to support OWL in Web Protege would make it, I think, very interesting to extend what we've done in Ikat to make it an editor for FHIR resources. And that's something I would love to be able to pursue with you guys.
Sorry, okay, I forgot to unmute myself when I was reading that question. You said that each disease must be categorized in only one hierarchy, that multiple inheritance is stripped away when the terms are published. Can you explain more about this? Why is this done?
Okay, it really was surprising to us, but it makes sense, because what WHO is mandated to do is to create the statistics that are used worldwide to identify the degree to which epidemics are occurring. So you want to know, for example, how many cases of SARS are there in a particular region? How many cases of Zika virus are there in a particular region? And what that requires is a mechanism whereby one might look at either more abstract or more specific disease descriptions in order to put this all together. In order to do that, you can't double count. If I want to know how many viral infections do I have in a particular region, I can't have Zika virus both be a viral infection and be a mosquito-borne infection for the purposes of doing the statistics. And so although my ontology can have multiple inheritance, and my ontology will have multiple inheritance to show how terms relate to one another in the most expressive way possible, when I create a linearization, it is just that. It's a linearization. It makes it such that there's a strict taxonomy, and so that as individual entities get counted up by the epidemiologists, the biostatisticians don't double count and therefore create misleading statistics.
Okay. When pre-coordinated terms are defined in terms of post-coordinated terms, how is this represented in OWL, or is it?
It is, and what we provide is a description of the post-coordinated entity in the hierarchy of foundational terms, and then we have pointers that go to the way in which that overall description was generated from the post-coordinated elements. So it gets a little bit complicated because we need to basically maintain two parallel representations, both of the post-coordinated possibilities as well as the internal ones. But there's no free lunch here.
Okay. When contributors used spreadsheets, how was the data turned into OWL, or was it? How did it relate to OWL?
We do that by making sure that rather than using any old spreadsheet, they at least use a spreadsheet that we have created where we can infer what is meant by the various columns in the spreadsheet. I'll just make an aside in that we were in a very awkward situation a few years ago when we were in Geneva looking at the contributions that were coming in through Ikat, and only realized after the fact that a large number of the contributions that were being made by the various developers had not actually made their way into the final product because of the fact that they were all using spreadsheets and hadn't found anybody to copy over their work in the spreadsheets into the Ikat tool. It just sort of reiterated and drove home the idea that spreadsheets are very hard to get rid of, and people just like tools that they're familiar with. So as a consequence, we've worked really hard to make spreadsheets that are easy to use, but by at least naming the columns in a consistent way and using technology we've created for other purposes, we can translate those columns into the appropriate OWL distinctions.
Great. Next question. How exactly is OWL used in ICD-11? Is it only used to represent disease relationships, or is it also used for metadata to drive ICAT, such as contributor comments?
It's used for all of those. So basically we have OWL as the standard representation for the hierarchy of terms. All of the embellishments of those term descriptions, the signs and symptoms of the disease, the anatomical location of the disease, those are all stored as OWL axioms as well. It turns out that some of the metadata related to change management doesn't need to be stored that way, and so we don't necessarily put that in OWL, but basically anything that deals with the intrinsic nature of the ICD-11 description is going to be in OWL.
Next question. Is there an OWL version of ICD-11 available for download?
I believe there is. If you go to BioPortal, which is bioportal.biontology.org, there is an older version of ICD-11 in OWL. The best way to see the most current version, of course, is to go to the web browser that WHO has created, but that doesn't allow you to see what's under the hood. You just see the terms through the web interface.
Is there a plan to make the OWL version of ICD-11 available on an ongoing basis?
Absolutely, but that's really up to WHO.
Okay. Yep. Okay, and the last question we have here is: will your slides be available online?
Yes, particularly since they were so poorly available this afternoon. Yes, I can do that. What I'll do is I will email those to you, David, and I guess you can post them.
Wonderful. Yep, I will do that. Okay, that's all the questions we have. Thank you very much, Dr. Musen, for joining us and for sharing your insights and experience on the use of OWL with ICD-11. And thanks very much to our audience for participating. If anyone would like to receive notice of future Yosemite Project events, browse to yosemityproject.org and click on the link to join our email list. Thank you again, and goodbye for now.